The candles flicker out, the hall holds its breath, and the most ruthless man in Sicily is relinquishing his throne with a single glance. The room was as silent as a tomb as Ennio orchestrated a marriage of convenience, forcing Isotta into it. But then the large door swung open. Ruggero Cavore walked in and tore up his own brother's chessboard, while Ritus, the icy shell frozen for 7 years, crumbled under the moonlight on the rooftop as he pressed her against the cold stone wall. His ragged breaths carried the scent of wood and desperate anguish, because the love of a leader is not about conquest but about complete surrender.
This was not the resolution she had engineered, yet it brought a dark form of gratitude. For 7 years, he had rendered her a phantom. In one identical room after another, his gaze would pass over her, a perfect void of recognition. For 7 years, she had consumed her own pride until this night when she chose to manifest by arriving on the arm of the wrong man. The shift in the atmosphere was a tangible force. The silence became a physical pressure, and for the first time in 7 years, he saw her, not as a woman, but as a spark thrown toward an open gas line. He moved across the room, took her hand without ceremony, and his whisper was a private declaration of war. "You have made a grave mistake by coming with him." What she had failed to grasp was that the prolonged silence was never born of indifference. It was a far more corrosive agent. By the time she understood its true nature, 2 brothers were locked in a quiet war over her, a prize whose value remained an enigma. One brother presented an escape so flawless it felt like a snare. The other offered a brand of protection that was indistinguishable from a prison. This was never a question of affection. It was a question of what secrets they were shielding and why those secrets were being kept. I am Lena, and this is merely the prologue. Chapter 1. The Blue Dress. She knew her presence there was a mistake. She knew it while tracing her eyeliner for a second time. Her hand a study in steadiness her nerves could not imitate. It the reflection of her Palermo apartment. She saw a woman fortified for any outcome. Internally, however, her rationale was fighting a losing battle. "You are truly going through with this," Giada stated from the bathroom doorway, her crossed arms serving as a pre-written judgment. She was her most trusted friend, the proprietor of a vintage boutique in the city's heart, and the one person who could decipher the layers of her poor choices before she could. Going through with what? She feigned, the question a hollow gesture as she adjusted the blue dress that adhered to her form with an unwavering certainty. Attending the annual Cavour ball with Ennio. Giada drew nearer, correcting a strap that had fallen from her shoulder. "Isotta, my dear, this isn't an act of bravery. This is a declaration of war fought with your cleavage." Isotta offered no reply. Her friend was correct, and to concede the point would make the evening's consequences too tangible. The Cavour family ball represented the social zenith of Sicily's east coast. She had attended since she was a child, initially as the daughter of a man within their sphere, and later as the young woman whose invitations were a subject of constant speculation. The reason was singular: pride. The same fierce, irrational pride that had sustained her since the age of 17, when her father's passing left her with only a hollowed name and a crippling weight of debt. 7 years later, at 24, she remained possessing the same steady hands and iron resolve. Yet she had learned that dignity is not a gift bestowed upon you. It is something one must battle for, clawing to maintain it day after day until it becomes an intrinsic part of you, like a scar. Giada observed her in the mirror, the amusement now absent from her expression. "Why Ennio, Isotta?" The answer was a truth so clear it stung. 7 years of Ruggero Cavore looking through her, as if she were made of glass, had driven her to the one position that could compel his attention. The arm of his brother. This gambit was never about Ennio. It was about the girl who was never seen, proving she could not be ignored. Because he extended the invitation, she stated, the click of her lipstick case punctuating the end of the discussion. The vehicle Ennio had arranged was an unmarked black sedan with the scent of new leather. She made the journey alone. Giada remained at the building's entrance, arms folded, her final words resonating. Contact me if things go poorly. Contact me if they go well also, because I will not rest until I have news. The drive to the estate near Catania was just long enough to question every decision, yet far too short to retreat. The Cavour villa emerged from the hills like a sentient organism. It was a fortress of stone, illuminated by low burning torches, encircled by a sea of automobiles that dispelled any notion of a simple gathering. This was a theater of power, and every element broadcast one message. We are the Cavour, and your presence here is by our permission alone. Ennio was positioned at the base of the grand staircase. At 27, Ruggiero's younger brother wielded a charm that doubled as a weapon. A practiced smile, warm eyes, and a touch so gentle it felt rehearsed. You are breathtaking, he murmured, offering his arm, his sincerity just a fraction too perfect. She accepted it, fully committing to her role. As they entered together, the room's energy changed, not with a sound, but with a sudden collective hush. She felt the weight of their gazes before she registered their faces. They were curious, appraising, calculating. In Sicily, to arrive at this specific ball with a Cavour is not a simple date. It is a public statement. Donna Silvia stood near the fireplace, carrying the posture of a queen who also hunted. The family's matriarch at 70 held a chilling grace. She assessed Isotta over the rim of her glass, her expression neither hostile nor surprised. It was something worse. It was an evaluation, as though she were determining her value before Isotta was even aware she was being measured. She met her gaze for 2 seconds before looking away, not as an act of submission, but to select a different battle for another time. Ennio navigated her through the throng with the innate ease of a man born into this world. She allowed him to guide her, yet her eyes searched, against her own volition, for the one individual she had sworn to herself she would not seek out. And then she found him. Ruggiero Cavour was standing by the bar, a glass in his hand, commanding the space with nothing more than his stillness. At 31, the head of the Cavour family inspired deference without uttering a single word. He was dressed in a black suit, without a tie, and the family signet, a crowned lion with a dagger clenched in its jaws, gleamed on his finger. His entire presence communicated a singular message. I am the danger that wears a suit of civility. He was completely motionless, his eyes fixed upon her. Isotta was familiar with Ruggiero's expressions, the one that saw through her, the one that deliberately avoided her, the one that categorized her with the room's furnishings. But this look was new. It had substance. It had heat. It held something she could not define but could feel in every nerve. She did not avert her gaze this time. She met his stare, channeling 7 years of silence into it. Her thoughts screaming, see me. At long last, see me. At her side, Ennio's hand tightened on her arm. When she glanced up at him, he was smiling. It was a smile that did not reach his eyes. It was the smile of someone who possessed knowledge you did not, as if her silent war with Ruggiero was the exact outcome he had orchestrated. Before she could analyze the implication, the room's focus shifted once more. Ruggiero was in motion. He placed his glass down without looking and traversed the floor with long, measured strides that caused people to part instinctively. Each step felt like a deliberate assault on the space that separated them. He halted directly before them, and the atmosphere held its breath. Then he took her hand, detaching it from Ennio's arm with a decisiveness that was not open to debate, leaning so near she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "You were wrong to come with him," he stated, his voice a low thrum meant only for her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a traitorous rhythm. She retracted her hand with the same force he had used to take it and stared into the dark eyes that had rendered her invisible for 7 years. "And you were wrong to ignore me for 7 years." Chapter 2: What the Silence Concealed. 3 days had elapsed since the ball, and Ruggiero Cavour had evidently concluded that the proper atonement for 7 years of silence was to become omnipresent. On Monday, he materialized at the cafe near her studio, where she always took her lunch. He did not enter. He maintained a sentinel's post across the street, a dark figure leaning against a black car, his arms folded as he studied the building's facade as if assessing its very soul. By the time she exited, he had vanished, but the proprietor informed her with a strained smile how a man, both polite and menacing, had inquired if she were a regular patron. On Wednesday, a restorer at the Palermo studio spoke of an odd phone call, an individual making inquiries about her schedule, her associates, her emotional state. The restorer assumed it was concerned family. Asada knew otherwise. On Thursday, the guard at her apartment building noted, with a studied nonchalance, that a black sedan had been positioned on her street each evening since the weekend. She did not need to ask whose it was. This was not Ruggiero providing safety. He was systematically dismantling her world, and the boundary between that and protection was so fine she could feel it on her skin, but could not identify its location. Ennio, by contrast, deployed a more nuanced strategy. White peonies were delivered to the workshop on Tuesday, a deliberate selection referencing a preference she could not recall ever sharing, thus sidestepping the typical rituals of courtship. A phone call arrived on Wednesday with an invitation to dinner, his tone unhurried, as though their time was without limit. On Thursday, a brief message simply asked after her well-being. His method was a masterclass in low-pressure engagement, devoid of any transparent ulterior motive. Ennio had an effortless charm Ruggiero could never simulate, projecting a warmth and thoughtfulness that was almost unsettlingly authentic. It was this impeccable performance that raised alarms. In the Cavour sphere, no act is without agenda, and kindness is merely currency for a later transaction. She conveyed this intelligence to Giada over the phone from her apartment, a migraine beginning to form behind her eyes from the sheer psychological toll. The resulting silence from her friend was a rare phenomenon, a pause in the stream of data before her incisive analysis arrived. The elder brother is conducting surveillance. The younger one is conducting a courtship. She paused. "My love, you are observing either a romance or a federal racketeering case. Sometimes they are one and the same." A brief spark of humor ignited, a tribute to Giada's gift for severing the heart of a matter. But as the laugh faded in her throat, the core issue remained. The true struggle was not between Ennio and Ruggiero. The conflict was entirely internal, a war waged between what she felt she was owed and what she actually desired, two concepts that appeared impossible to align. By Friday, she had entombed herself within the atelier. Its location in Palermo's ancient quarter, with thick stone walls that resisted the Sicilian heat, offered a cool, silent sanctuary. She was in the process of restoring a 17th century altarpiece, a task requiring a physical stillness she could only achieve when the world outside was not actively attempting to pull her apart. After an hour of profound quiet, the door swung open without a preceding knock, the unmistakable signature of a man who never needed to request permission to enter. Ruggiero's presence in the doorway was a distortion of space, a force that seemed to compress the workshop around him. His sleeves, rolled to the elbow, offered a rare view of his forearms, an unexpected detail that felt like a breach in his formal defenses. I interpreted this glimpse of skin as a momentary fissure in his otherwise impenetrable facade. His gaze performed a sweeping, tactical assessment of the room, an instinct honed for crowds, yet tonight, its sole focus was me. "Your workday concluded an hour ago," he observed, his tone asserting an unspoken claim to this knowledge. "Was that a report from your surveillance or a clause you found in my contract?" My attention remained fixed on the artifact. Though my hands maintained their composure, my entire nervous system registered a state of high alert. He crossed the threshold, the definitive click of the latch sealing the space behind him. The studio, though spacious, suddenly felt airless, his proximity inducing a potent wave of claustrophobia. He moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, his eyes cataloging each tool and canvas before they finally settled on me from 6 feet away. The silence between us became a tangible force, dense and charged with a keen metallic tension. Setting down my implements, I turned to face him. The pretense of work was a fiction my body would no longer sustain. "State your purpose, Ruggero." "To converse." "You don't converse. You issue directives and allow the ensuing silence to enforce them." The faintest shadow of a smile touched his lips, a barely perceptible reaction that I cursed myself for being observant enough to notice. "An accurate summary." "I'm aware." I braced for what was next. "What has changed?" He eliminated the distance between us, compelling me to adjust my stance, tightening the invisible wire of tension. "You were escorted by my brother," he stated, the rigid control in his voice failing to mask an undercurrent of something visceral. He extended an invitation. You did not. The strike landed. I watched it register in the clenching of his jaw, in the tempest gathering in his eyes. Ruggero Cavalli was a man unequipped to handle a truth he had not orchestrated. "I had my justifications," he said, following a silence that spanned the length of 3 of my own frantic heartbeats. "Justifications offer no warmth, Ruggero." The words slipped out, imbued with the weight of years of unspoken longing and engineered distance. They were the product of a prolonged, solitary campaign to extinguish a feeling that refused to die. The impact on his face was that of a physical blow, a sharp blade finding its way between his ribs. For one protracted moment, I believed he might do something to demolish the meticulous rules of our dynamic, an act that would alter the entire landscape. The moment was fractured by the appearance of Tassilo, whose stark posture signaled his readiness for a conflict zone. As Ruggero's long-serving right hand, Tassilo was a figure of few words and acute perception. His gaze sliced between us, deconstructing our proximity and expressions with the velocity of an operative neutralizing a threat. "I will be in the vehicle," Tassilo stated, his tone neutral as he withdrew. 2 seconds later, he reappeared, adding a single word. "Again." The door closed, and Ruggero released a breath, a clear signal of his exasperation as he retreated a step. The volatile charge between us lost its most acute point, yet it lingered, heavy in the atmosphere. He gave me a final, incendiary look. a communication so fraught with conflict I could not decipher if it was a vow or a menace, before turning and departing without further comment. In his absence, I remained motionless, my body consumed by tremors and a racing pulse for the first time in ages. 20 minutes elapsed before I could summon the composure to call Giada. Pressing my head against the cool stone of the wall, my eyes shut tight. After I concluded my account, she was silent for a record-breaking 3 seconds. "Well," she finally offered, her voice uncharacteristically soft, "if telling him justifications offer no warmth failed to breach his defenses, nothing will. Go home. Tomorrow is for devising a strategy to manage the man who mistakes obsession for courtship." I disconnected the call, secured the atelier, and navigated the Palermo streets toward home. The memory of his scent clung to my thoughts like a phantom. The following day, Ennio suggested we convene at a subdued restaurant. He was an image of perfection. His attire was immaculate, his smile a masterwork of placating charm. Our discussion began with ease, covering my art and my life, a clinical execution of establishing rapport. The sense of comfort he manufactured was a beautiful, lethal illusion, and soon he enacted a deliberate tonal pivot, the unmistakable sign of a planned conversational gambit. He remarked with calculated nonchalance on his awareness of my father's unresolved blood debt. A current of pure adrenaline arrested my movements, my hands freezing as the ambient sound of the world faded to nothing. My entire consciousness narrowed to his steady voice articulating a reality that would shatter my own. "Do not be concerned," he said, his expression placid, his gaze locking with mine. "I possess the means to erase it." Case 3, the blood debt. I did not sleep that night. Ennio's phrase, "I possess the means to erase it," replayed in a relentless, agonizing circuit inside my mind. Every one of my instincts recoiled from the notion that his proposition was born of benevolence. In their world, such a gesture was invariably the overture to a price. I returned to the restaurant the next morning. Ennio was already present, his composed demeanor implying he had foreseen my arrival, like a man observing the aftermath of a detonation he himself had triggered. "You anticipated my return," I stated, bypassing all ceremony. "I was optimistic," he replied, motioning toward the coffee. "Surrender is not a part of your character." I disregarded the gesture. "Explain everything." Steve. Ennio then detailed the situation with the patience of an educator and the precision of a litigator. My father was indebted to the Cavalli family, an old and profound liability incurred before I was a teenager. According to the family's own brutal, uncodified laws, the cost of such a debt was a life. For years, the obligation had remained inert, neither absolved nor collected. It functioned as a perpetual, unspoken menace, a chambered round that any member of the family could elect to fire at will. "And your proposed remedy?" I asked, my voice a fragile veneer over the turmoil within. "Marriage," he stated, the word delivered with the detached gravity of a corporate merger. "To me, the union would balance the ledger. You would be secure, shielded, and integrated into the family by right, not by obligation." I felt a crushing sensation in my chest, the undeniable somatic response to absolute shock. She examined Ennio's brown eyes, looking past the fabricated earnestness for the cold, manipulative calculus working underneath. A concealed threat lay coiled behind his gaze, its form expertly camouflaged. "I will consider it," she said. A strategic withdrawal masquerading as deliberation. In relaying the encounter to her friend, Giada, she felt the vicarious dread of her listener. Giada's assessment was immediate and merciless. Isota. This is a transaction, not a romance. Your person is not a commodity. The reasoning was irrefutable, yet it failed to pierce the overwhelming burden of 24 years of inherited devastation. That afternoon, she arranged a meeting with Severo, the Cavalli family's consigliere, a man in his early 70s who exuded a lifetime of observing the tides of power. In an office that smelled of finality and archival dust, he awaited her query with the forbearance of one who already possessed the answer. The liability is genuine, he affirmed, his delivery final. Who is the creditor? She pushed. For the first time, Severo's stare shifted away, a micro-expression of avoidance she mentally filed away. That is a matter for the head of the family. The statement was a closed gate, but his averted gaze was a key she had just acquired. Twilight descended on Catania as she drove toward the Cavalli estate, propelled by an urgent need for the unvarnished truth. Ruggiero was the sole person who could provide it. She was, however, intercepted in the hallway by Donna Silvia, the matriarch's presence a calculated obstruction. The older woman's eyes conducted a frigid evaluation, an assertion of dominance that preceded her verbal assault. You are not the wife of a boss, she declared, her voice stripped of all warmth. You are the daughter of a debtor. Do not confuse his interest with your status. Each sentence was a precision strike against Isota's most vulnerable psychic defenses. Every syllable pierced the one conviction that preserved her identity, that her own worth was distinct from her father's legacy of failure. Donna Silvia pivoted and departed without awaiting a response, dismissing her as a non-entity. Isota paused for 3 seconds to compose herself before violating all protocol and entering Ruggiero's office without being announced. He was hunched over his desk, exhibiting the visible strain of a man shouldering immense responsibility. When he raised his head, his features softened for the briefest of moments, a fissure in his defenses that she did not fail to register. My father's liability, she started, dispensing with all formalities. Who holds the title to it? Ruggiero subjected her to a long, analytical silence, a well-worn instrument of control. After 7 years of being conditioned to feel like an apparition, she withstood the pressure. I do, he finally answered, the words carrying the weight of a judicial ruling. A tremor passed through her, but she remained standing, denying him the victory of witnessing her weakness. She stood her ground, assimilating the colossal truth. Ruggiero Cavour had for years secretly held the reins of her entire existence. For 7 years, he had the capacity to annihilate her, yet he had chosen to do nothing but affect a deliberate, soul-crushing neutrality. He had looked past her as if she were transparent, all the while possessing the deed to her whole future. A complex, metallic rage began to rise in her throat. It was a fury born from the staggering paradox that the primary architect of her torment had also been her silent, unacknowledged guardian. The contradiction rendered her mute, ensnared within a disorienting tempest of cognition. Her only recourse was to withdraw. She pivoted and departed. In the corridor, Ennio stood, his posture broadcasting a perfect knowledge of the preceding events. His features were a study in feigned pity, yet his eyes held a sharp, strategic glint. Now you understand, he stated softly, the alternative I presented. In Chapter 4, What No One Was Supposed to See, she began a period of profound isolation, the mind's only defense against such a violation. Disconnecting from both Rogero and Ennio, she ceased her work and, for 2 days, surrendered to an immobilizing rage. Giada was the sole person she permitted entry. She arrived that first evening with wine, offering a fellowship of silence. When Isota's narrative finally emerged, it came in fractured segments, a shattered cartography of her existence. Giada listened, carefully assembling the shards. "The cruelty is not the act itself," Isota admitted. "It is the not knowing whether to feel indebted or incensed, and the effort to be both simultaneously is tearing me apart." Giada remained silent, contemplating the duality. Her diagnosis was a somber verdict on Isota's reality. "It is both a shield and a cage," she posited. And in that paradox lies the true horror. When an act is simultaneously protective and confining, you lose your bearings entirely. This perfectly encapsulated the psychological limbo she was in, a disorienting state with no clear object for her anger or mercy. Into this vacuum of indecision, Ennio launched his campaign, elevating a private debt onto a public stage with a formal marriage proposal. By making his offer public, he engineered a situation where refusal was impossible. Donna Silvia's blessing was given, and Severo's silence served as its own form of consent. In less than 48 hours, her life had been reduced to a gambit in a political contest. Rogero's countermove was a masterwork of subterranean warfare, the calculated response of an autocrat whose authority had been challenged. He avoided open conflict, choosing instead to systematically dismantle Ennio's base of power with clinical precision, voiding his contracts and reallocating his assets. The conflict between the brothers thus evolved from the personal to the structural, with her positioned as the unspoken prize at its core. On the third night, Isota's static rage finally melted into an urgent need for confrontation. She had to stand before Ruggiero to extract from him a truth not veiled in his customary manipulative silence. She located him in his study, where the indicators of stress were undeniable. His tie was absent, his eyes were fatigued, and a glass of whiskey was near his hand. As she crossed the threshold, a brief expression resembling relief appeared on his face before his mask of control fell back into place. "You disappeared," he observed. "You deceived me," she countered, "for 7 years." "I did not deceive. I omitted. It is the same thing when the silence carries such weight." He turned his back to her, a gesture of defense. She could see the tension coiled in his shoulders. "Why acquire the debt?" she inquired, her voice low and burdened by the question's gravity. "Isota, why?" He pivoted, and for the first time she witnessed a profound fracture in his composure, a fault line running through his meticulously built defenses. The formidable Cavour leader vanished, replaced by a broken figure. "Because had any other man acquired it," he said, his voice raw, every word seeming to cost him something essential, "you would not be here now. You would be in his residence, bearing his name, enduring a life that was never your destiny." The statement was a calculated blow, reframing his control as her deliverance. She required the unvarnished truth, stripped of the veneer the family applied to everything. Her eyes stung with tears she refused to shed, and she bit her inner cheek, denying him the sight of that vulnerability. "Was your method substantively different?" she challenged, her voice trembling slightly. "You held me captive in a prison of ignorance. That is not protection, Ruggiero. That is ownership." Her accusation found its mark. He winced, his eyes shutting as a muscle spasmed in his jaw. When they reopened, the fissure in his soul was wider. The silence that ensued was thick with the weight of all they had just destroyed. Rogero advanced toward her. She held her position, not from courage, but from a peculiar paralysis that had taken hold of her limbs, resisting her impulse to retreat. He narrowed the distance until she could perceive the warmth emanating from him. He bent forward slowly, pressing his forehead to hers. With his eyes closed, his breathing was a warm, unstable presence against her lips. He carried the scent of wood smoke and a vast, soul-deep exhaustion, as if his 7-year secret had exacted a heavy toll. "I know," he breathed, the 2 words containing years of remorse, apprehension, and unspoken longing. A silent admission pressed into her skin. She was on the precipice of yielding to him, of claiming a solace she desperately needed, just as the office door swung open unannounced. Tassilo was there, his acute gaze absorbing the scene in a single instant. The 2 of them, foreheads joined, without any space between them, the atmosphere heavy with unsaid things, but his expression conveyed a new and visceral urgency. "Boss," he said, his voice stripped of its usual monotone. It was an alarm bell. The tension in the study was a wire stretched to the point of breaking. "Ennio is in the hall. He has a priest." The words detonated in the air. Rogero recoiled as if physically struck, his face a portrait of pure, unguarded astonishment. His gaze shifted from Tassilo to her, the vulnerability vaporizing, supplanted by a frigid and dangerous calm. Ennio had revealed his gambit, using the symbols of church and family to compel a public confrontation. Rogero, the master strategist, was being boxed in by his own brother. Observing him, she understood that for the first time, his next move was entirely unpredictable. He could either yield to custom and sacrifice her, or he could declare war to assert his claim. Throughout his silent calculus, she remained immobile in the study, a voiceless object whose destiny was now a currency in a fraternal power struggle, her own agency completely removed from the equation. Chapter 5: The Public Confrontation. The great hall of the Cavour estate was staged for a sentencing, not a discussion. Chairs were set in a tribunal's curve, occupied by family members who sat like statues awaiting a declaration of fate. At its center stood Ennio Cavour, a priest by his side, his smile perfected, suggesting her agreement was a simple procedural step in a settled affair. The summons had not specified a ceremony. It read simply, "Formal meeting regarding the debt," and was delivered by Tassilo himself that morning. He had lingered at her Palermo doorway for 2 seconds too long, the envelope suspended between them like a forbidden object. His expression conveyed not merely reluctance, but the look of a man burdened by foreknowledge, sharing just enough to clear his conscience in the future. He began to speak, but then restrained himself, saying only, "Exercise caution when you read it." She interpreted his warning as standard procedure. She drove to the Catania estate in a simple dress, her fear a tight coil beneath a placid surface, expecting a negotiation of ledgers and legal terms. The choice, she had presumed, would belong to her in the end. But upon entering the hall and registering the priest's vestment, the audience assembled before her, the expectant looks, all centered on Ennio's victorious smile, that entire illusion disintegrated. It was not an abrupt fracture, but a gradual corrosion of her certainty, like a carefully set trap slowly revealing its jaws. Donna Silvia occupied a seat in the front row. The Cavour matriarch was, per usual, a figure of absolute composure, dressed in dark silks with an impeccable coiffure, her hands clasped with the serenity of a monarch whose authority is implicit. The family signet, a crowned lion brandishing a dagger, gleamed on her finger, a potent symbol of the lineage she would never formally enter. The matriarch's posture was a silent edict of endorsement, suffused with the deep satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan reaching its conclusion. Ennio advanced by 2 paces. His smile was a charming offensive, his tone disarmingly gentle, as if he were bestowing a priceless gift. "Isotta," he began. His arms opened in a gesture that mimicked a welcome, but functioned as a barrier. "I appreciate your attendance. I have come to discuss the debt," she replied, her voice emerging colder than she intended, her entire being already signaling imminent threat. "As we will," he confirmed, directing the room as a maestro would his ensemble. Ennio articulated his proposal with polished refinement, framing this marriage as the most honorable resolution to a debt he claimed was not her burden to bear. He employed gilded concepts: honor, protection, tradition, unity, arranging them like a gem setter to fashion an argument that was nearly impossible to refuse. Her father's blood debt would be nullified by a marriage agreement. She would be integrated into the Cavour clan, granted their formal protection. The stigma that had shadowed her name since childhood would be ceremonially erased within a period he suggested of 30 days. "My proposal is straightforward," he proclaimed to the gathering, his self-assurance absolute. "This union resolves the debt and upholds our family's honor. Isotta is no longer a debtor's daughter, but becomes a Cavour wife. The account is settled. Tradition is honored." Donna Silvia inclined her head. The movement was minute, nearly imperceptible, yet it carried the force of a final ruling. The matriarch had issued her consent, a power in the Cavour domain rivaled only by the Don himself. A survey of the room confirmed a singular collective sentiment. "This is the proper course. This is your function. Accept this arrangement and stop being an issue." "What are the terms?" she inquired, the question a final, desperate gambit to gain time as the foundation of her world gave way. Ennio laid out the timelines and clauses with the dispassionate chill of an executor reading a final testament. "And if I decline?" she countered. A vacuum formed in the room, the air thickening with the weight of unbreathed air. With a condescending tilt of his head, Ennio's soft tone became a weapon. "The liability stands, Isotta. Its holder may collect through any means he deems appropriate." The menace was unambiguous, wrapped in the silken delivery he reserved for all edicts, particularly the violent ones. The family's shared glances became a silent tribunal, rendering its foregone conclusion. I was the last to grasp that my own voice was merely a prop in their theater. My gaze fixed on the main doors, the dark, heavy wood through which Ruggiero had passed countless times. His distinct, burdened tread, the sound of a man shouldering his world alone, was absent. The doors remained shut. He was not coming. The void that opened in my chest was not of surprise, but of certainty. It was the specific torture of fearing the worst, praying for error, and being proven right. Ruggiero had failed to appear, the man who once pressed his forehead to mine and murmured, "I know." The man who acquired my debt simply to shield me. The man who had crossed a crowded ballroom to claim my hand from his brother's grasp. That man had vanished, and his absence was a pronouncement far louder than any word Ennio had uttered. I parted my lips, uncertain what would emerge: defiance, a query, or the form of silence that is its own surrender. The priest regarded me with clerical pity. Donna Sylvia watched with the patience of one waiting for dusk, and Ennio held my gaze with the placid confidence of a monarch whose victory is assured. In that silent beat, the side door crashed open, its percussive impact against the wall echoing like a gunshot. Giada burst into the hall, propelled by the frantic momentum of one escaping a conflagration, the sole actor driven by the instinct to flee. Her dark hair was in disarray, her breathing a series of ragged gasps, her eyes lit with a fury found only in those who love enough to act beyond reason. Tassilo had summoned her. The brief glance she cast toward the door as she moved confirmed it. A flicker of acknowledgement exchanged between confederates. And the thought landed, a sharp pebble in my shoe. Even through the wave of relief, the same man who offered the invitation, fully aware of its true nature, was the one who had arranged my deliverance. He could have alerted me directly. He could have spoken the truth on my doorstep that morning instead of allowing me to enter this chamber expecting a negotiation. He had not. He selected a strategy that ensured my friend's safety, secured his own position, and led me unknowingly into the trap. I filed away this piece of the puzzle, another anomaly to be analyzed when the entire monstrous design became visible. Giada bypassed every dignitary in the room. She moved past captains as if they were scenery. She strode before Donna Sylvia without averting her gaze and halted beside me, a bastion of worn cloth, a sharp wit, and a fealty that had no price. If you consent to this charade, she hissed, her grip on my arm tight enough to mark me, I will physically remove you from this estate. My eyes stung. The constriction in my throat became so severe, I feared it would suffocate me. Not from terror, not from sorrow, but from relief. The profound solace of knowing that in a room rife with power and protocol, where my existence was being bartered like a commodity, someone had arrived solely for me. Not for gain, or for strategy, or for obligation. Giada was here because I was her person and she was mine, a connection more elemental than any other. No vow, no document, just the decision to appear when all else has fallen away. I squeezed her hand in reply, and then the main doors swung open. Ruggiero did not rush. No announcement heralded his arrival, no dramatic flourish. He simply breached the threshold, and the room's very atmosphere buckled, each person shifting as if realigned by a new gravitational center. Family members sat taller, a physical correction that preceded conscious recognition. The priest took a reflexive step backward, his form flush against the wall, driven by a primal need to create distance from a threat his mind had yet to process. Donna Sylvia's gaze honed to a blade's edge in the light, assessing, calculating whether this constituted an act of war or simple defiance. Ennio stood immobile, the first fissure appearing in his placid smile, a minute tremor at its edge. Ruggiero's focus was fixed forward, his gaze bypassing me, his mother, the church, and the powerful figures whose presence was mere custom. He advanced with singular intent toward his brother, closing the space to a mere 3 feet, their contrasts thrown into stark, inescapable relief. Their eyes met, and the ensuing stillness was laden with the weight of words that could never be retracted. Ennio returned the stare, a performance of courage I fully comprehended, because to meet Ruggiero's eyes at that moment was to face a furnace, praying the intervening glass would hold. Ruggiero's voice was quiet, yet the room's absolute silence amplified each syllable, making his words resonate like a decree in an empty square. She will not be your wife. I hold this debt. I hold this authority, and my answer is no. The chamber held its collective breath. I saw Donna Silvia's hand clench her chair, a physical struggle against her own impulse. I saw Severo's eyes close for a moment, the weary resignation of a man hearing a structure's first groan before its collapse. I saw the priest's eyes dart to the exit, his face a frantic map of an escape route that was impossibly distant. Ennio's smile persisted, but it had transformed from congenial to lethal, its warmth cooling into the fine edge of a whetted blade. "That answer is hers to give, brother," he proclaimed, turning to me with a sweeping gesture, a performance designed to restore a power Ruggiero had just seized. Both men's gazes fell upon me. Then, so did the entire room's. I felt the collective stare as a physical pressure. It bore down on my shoulders, my chest, my limbs, a force compelling every part of me to collapse and let another decide. Capitulation would be simple. Agree, sign the document, adopt the name, and be carried by whatever current prevailed. This was the room's unified will. This was tradition's demand. It was the path carved by generations of women before me. Accept the terms and remain silent. Giada's hand tightened on mine, a swift, firm pressure that requested nothing but offered everything. A silent confirmation. I am your foundation. You are not enduring this alone. Do what is right. My eyes found Ennio, the designer of a gilded prison presented as a haven, a man who viewed my debt as an asset and my body as collateral. He returned my look with an expression that might pass for warmth elsewhere, but in this calculated production, it was merely another instrument of a polite and ravenous ambition. Then I looked to Ruggiero. He stood 10 feet away, his posture familiar, yet his shoulders were wired with a new tension. Not authority, but anticipation. His eyes, however, were changed. They were empty of commands, of strategy. They were stripped of the cold armor I had so long mistaken for indifference. What I saw there disquieted me more than anything else in that chamber. It was vulnerability, raw, undefended, and total. The quiet terror of a man facing, perhaps for the first time, an utter deprivation of control. He was no longer the agent, but the object. He was only waiting, and this state of passivity was costing him more than any battle he had ever waged. Ruggiero Cavouri, the commander, the myth, the man whose silence moved armies, was standing before me, completely exposed, awaiting my judgment. And in that impossible reversal, I finally grasped a truth he may have long understood. Love is not the antithesis of control, but the act of its surrender. I took a deep breath. The air felt unfamiliar in my lungs, purifying, and with it arrived a startling clarity. It was sharp and clean, free of the fury that had driven me and the dread that had paralyzed me. In their stead was something more essential and far more powerful. Resolve. I knew what I was, not a commodity, not a clause in a contract, not a piece in a game of fraternal conflict. I was Isida Ferry, a woman who mended what others threw away, who commanded her own esteem, and who now stood in defiance of men completely adrift when confronted by someone refusing their assigned part. My father's debt is not my burden, I stated, my voice surprisingly firm, forged from 24 years of suppressed emotion and practiced composure. I am not property to be exchanged. I then allowed the quiet to stretch, claiming it, wielding it as my first true act of power. The silence was finally my own. I would not be the one to break it. But should I choose to form a pact, I went on, my gaze locking with Ruggiero's, then I will choose the man, and I will establish the conditions. Everyone in the chamber seemed to cease breathing. I held Ruggiero's gaze, which after years of avoidance now latched onto me with the desperation of one terrified of total loss. My voice was low, intended only for him, but its quality was absolute, an ultimatum. On my conditions, Ruggiero. His stare lingered, a silent acknowledgement of a history unvoiced. His reply, when it arrived, was a raw whisper, a concession that had cost him more than any battlefield defeat. On your conditions. We entered Chapter 6, the aftermath. There was no grand catharsis, no shouting, no commendation, none of the dramatic release one might anticipate from such a turning point. What transpired was not loud, but profoundly seismic. The architecture of power within the room was fundamentally redrawn. Observers struggled to process the paradigm shift in real time. The patriarch of the Cavari family, a figure defined by his rigid authority, had just yielded to a woman their world had systemically silenced. Donna Sylvia rose, her motions precise, each gesture a calculated consequence. Her gaze acknowledged neither Ruggiero nor the woman who had won. She exited with a frigid elegance, her posture unbent, each step on the marble a sharp pronouncement, a judgment merely postponed, not forgotten. Ennio assimilated his defeat. The only tells were a tightening of his jaw and a look now emptied of all but cold calculation. The mask of affability had fractured, exposing the strategist beneath, already recalibrating his next gambit after a lost skirmish. He adjusted a cuff with mechanical dispassion, offered the priest a clipped nod, and vanished through a side door, never glancing back. This exit was more chilling than any overt threat. While rage is a measurable force, Ennio's quiet machinations were a far more insidious poison. Severo exhaled slowly, shedding the accumulated tension of the confrontation. His gaze shifted between Ruggiero and her, a glimmer of relief animating the old consigliere's features. He resembled a lighthouse keeper who had just watched a ship navigate a tempest and find safe harbor. Once the room cleared, Giada enveloped her in a fierce embrace. It was not a gesture of comfort, but a powerful, crushing act meant to expel both air and suppressed emotion. The tremor in Giada's shoulders betrayed that her tears had arrived first, a familiar pattern, for she always experienced the other's pain with a rawness the woman herself refused to display. You defied an entire family. She breathed into her shoulder, her voice laden with emotion, each word steeped in a pride that felt deeply personal. I have never been more proud. The reply was a short, trembling laugh laced with unshed tears, less an expression of joy than a release of immense pressure, an emotion far too nuanced for that moment. Comprehending the magnitude of her actions would have to wait, arriving in fragments later. She framed Giada's face with her hands. Thank you for being here. Always, came the reply, a single word affirming a fierce loyalty, a covenant more powerful than the Cavouri name, the debt, or any man. Giada pulled away, wiping her eyes on her sleeve, and announced a need for wine and a month's sabbatical. She left with the unvarnished honesty of one who feels without apology. And then she was alone, standing in the center of the vacant hall, the air heavy with the ghost of extinguished candles and irrevocable choices. She felt the steady rhythm of her own heart and a strange anchoring gravity, as if the ground she stood on was finally her own. Ruggiero's approach lacked his usual predatory cadence. His steps were deliberate, cautious, as if the space between them was now hallowed ground. You came, she said, her voice softer than intended, the relief of his presence breaching her final defense. I almost didn't, he answered. the raw honesty of it striking with more force than any platitude. Why? He halted, close enough to radiate heat, but distant enough to maintain the last shred of pride he was already forfeiting, for his presence was a choice, and that choice signified the relinquishing of an empire built over a lifetime. His eyes conducted a slow inventory of her face, the careful focus of a man memorizing something priceless he feared he might lose. But not coming here meant losing you. At the threshold I decided nothing I owned was worth that. The very physics between them altered. The charged political tension dissipated, supplanted by a more volatile, silent force, the primal, magnetic energy that had always been their unspoken language, an instinct they had both failed to suppress. She offered no reply. None was required. For the first time in her life with Ruggiero Cavouri, their union was not a product of debt or duty, but of a mutual, fractured, and monumental choice. They exited through the main doors into the warm Sicilian night, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and salt. On the hills, the estate's lights looked like fallen constellations, while from the mansion, muffled sounds suggested an order being restored to chaos. They walked through a garden lit by torches, and the quiet that enveloped them was unlike any they had known before. It was not his characteristic silence of guarded distance, nor her silence born of self-preservation. It was a shared territory, tentative and freighted with unspoken history. Yet for once, it was not founded on deception. Then he stopped. As he turned to her, a nearby torch cast one side of his face in light and the other in shadow, a perfect portrait of Ruggiero Cavouri's very essence. "Do you want the truth?" he asked. His voice held a new timbre. Fear, not the tactical fear of an adversary, but the vulnerability of a man about to offer a confession, uncertain of the verdict. All of it. A breeze carried the scent of lemon groves between them, as if to cleanse the air of their last confrontation's ghosts. She watched him, his dark eyes, after 7 years of looking through her, now fixed upon her, as if she held the answer to a question he was too terrified to voice. Her words affirmed the one thing she had always required and he had perpetually denied. "It's the only piece that was ever missing." Chapter 7. The Speaking Silence. The Cavouri estate had a terrace she had never seen after dark. It was situated on the villa's eastern wing, projecting out over a cascade of olive groves that sloped toward the sea. From there one could see the coastline of Catania, a shimmering illusion on the horizon. Ruggiero led her there without a word, ascending a stone staircase so narrow they moved in single file. He went first, and she followed. The 30-step climb was just long enough to contemplate that this man had just chosen her over his entire world, a reality her mind had not yet begun to unpack. The terrace itself was austere. Weathered stone, a moss-covered parapet, and 2 iron chairs that seemed to predate his family's ascendancy. A gibbous moon cast an ethereal blue light, imbuing the scene with a sense of timelessness. He rested his hands on the wall, staring out at the black water. She stood behind him, her arms crossed in a posture of defense. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a clear physiological signal of acute stress. The quiet between them was not hostile but heavy, the kind of stillness preceding a battle where both sides understand the world is about to be remade. He began. "3 groups bid for your debt," he said, his focus fixed on the horizon. His voice was lower, divested of its typical authority, as if he were consciously setting aside his power. She remained motionless, saying nothing. 2 of them plan to use you as collateral. His jaw tightened on the word collateral, a brief flash of pure revulsion. The third would have sold you to the Ferrante syndicate. They view people as assets. Their methods would have been predictable. She stated, I know you were the one who acquired it. Then she pressed him on the years of silence that had ensued. He turned, his features carved from moonlight, because they would have weaponized my feelings for you. The confession landed like a physical impact, cracking the emotional fortifications she had spent years constructing. You disappeared, she repeated, the statement transforming from a question into an indictment. His confession occupied the air between us, a doctrine laid bare. Emotion is weakness, and weakness is a liability. I grasped the cold calculus, yet it could not easily penetrate the armor of resentment forged by this man's very logic. You kept your distance, I observed, for 7 years, for my safety. To ensure your survival, he corrected, and you believed that was sufficient. A waver on the final word exposed the wound I sought to conceal. The damage was visible. My preservation demanded my complete non-existence? Ruggiero paused before he replied. He remained motionless, his stare a tangible pressure against my skin. The expression he wore was a raw testament to his guilt, more powerful than any apology. He comprehended the depth of his miscalculation, that his version of protection had been a 7-year term of imposed isolation and the corrosive fear of my own insignificance. This realization was an open wound on his face. Every time I had to look past you, he admitted, his voice quiet and near, I would return to this place. I watched the water and believed that one day you would hear it all. I would find you, look you in the eye, and tell you that every moment of silence was a war that cost me more than any I've ever fought. A gust of wind swept a strand of her hair across her eyes. Before she could react, Ruggiero's hand lifted with a slight hesitation, as if violating a code he had lived by for years. His fingers gently tucked the strand back, a tenderness that was dissonant with the man she knew. The touch sent a current of pure electricity from the base of her spine to the back of her neck. He did not withdraw his hand. His fingers then traced the line of her jaw, slowly charting a territory he had previously only observed from a distance. His thumb came to rest at the corner of her mouth, its pressure as light as a whisper. I lost 7 years, she said, her voice thin and unfamiliar. 7 years that could have been ours. I know. I thought you didn't even see me. I saw everything, he said, and the words struck her with the force of a breaking wave. I saw you walk into rooms and pretend I didn't exist. His anger was not a simple fire. It was a complex reconfiguration of pain. He described witnessing Isada's veiled misery, the forced smiles and early departures as a series of internal wounds. The sharp sting of personal rejection had metamorphosed into a deep, agonizing empathy. This was the fury born of stolen time, of a shared but silent torment. He had been communicating in the only way his world allowed, through a protective silence meant to shield her from the very danger he embodied. She then establishes a new paradigm with a statement that is not a plea but a decree. He will never again treat her as invisible. This is the first time she wields the authority he has just publicly granted her. His reply, never again, is delivered with the weight of a solemn vow. While logic called for further interrogation, a primal instinct took over. All that registered was his residual warmth and a proximity that had become an inescapable force. the antithesis of their long-standing pain. It marked the armistice between two souls who had finally laid down their arms. Their kiss can only be described as a mutual collapse, an inevitable closing of a gap that seemed predestined. There was no frenzy or desperation, but rather the deliberate, inexorable pull of a conclusion authored long ago. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, a stark contrast to the ruthless persona he projected. This was not an act of conquest, but one of complete capitulation, a man finally yielding to the single force he could never dominate. His hand moved to her neck, tangling in her hair, tilting her head in a gesture of firm, possessive claim. The nature of the kiss shifted. No longer a tender surrender, but igniting with a voracious heat born of protracted starvation. The taste of him was rich with wine and warmth. His arms became vices around her waist, crushing their bodies together. The solid reality of his form, the sheer power of his embrace, and the elemental scent of his skin sent her entire world into a spin. It was a descent into free fall, where he was the only stable ground. He trapped her against the cold stone of the terrace, the jarring chill on her back contrasting with the inferno of his body, forcing a quiet gasp from her. Ruggiero broke contact, his gaze locking with hers with an intensity that felt like a tangible impact. "If you wish for me to cease," he said, his voice ragged, "the time to speak is now. My self-control is disintegrating." In his eyes, the same eyes that had averted hers for 7 years, she saw a craving not merely for her body, but for her very essence. It was the desperate plea of a man who has found his solitary light and fears its imminent extinction. "I have waited 7 years," she whispered, her hand flat against his chest, registering the chaotic rhythm of his heart beneath the composed exterior. "Do not dare to stop now." A primitive, guttural sound of capitulation was torn from his throat, a vibration she felt just before his mouth crushed hers again. Any pretense of gentleness had vanished. He consumed her lips with a ferocity that drove her into the wall, his hands mapping her spine in a gesture that was both a supplication and a command. She clung to his rigid, quivering shoulders, eliminating any space between them, as it was now intolerable. His hand located the strap of her gown, displacing it from her shoulder with an excruciating slowness. The abrasion of his hardened fingers on her skin was a testament to a restraint stretched to its absolute limit. His mouth followed, charting a slow burning course down her neck, setting every nerve alight. He analyzed the contour of her throat, pausing over her pulse as if committing its frantic cadence to memory. His heated breath against her skin compelled her to arch against him. His lips settled at the juncture of her neck and shoulder, a constant steadying presence, while his hands held her waist. His body was a firm, unyielding pressure. His hips began to move in a slow, deliberate rhythm. This was a clothed friction, a promise of what was to come, building a deep, radiating heat between them. He murmured against her skin, the words a clandestine vibration. "For all this time, I kept my distance, never imagining one could miss a person they had never possessed." She shut her eyes, weaving her fingers into his hair, feeling him yield to her touch as if it were a long-awaited absolution. The established dynamic between them had been utterly demolished. A man who governed his universe with absolute control was now completely undone, his nearness a testament to his shattered defenses. His surrender was not a sudden implosion, but the slow, certain degradation of a fortress built over years. The intimacy they shared existed not in a singular action, but in the interstitial moments, in the staggered breaths, the trembling contact, and the unspoken pressure that conveyed a profound spiritual need. As the world slowly came back into focus, she found herself pressed against him, her ear attuned to the frantic percussion of his heart. He held on to her as though she were the sole point of stability in a world he had just irrevocably altered. Nothing else held any meaning. "Do not exclude me again," she commanded in a low tone. "Never again," he replied, the words forming a raw oath. He reinforced this pledge by tightening his embrace, his breathing steadying, as if branding her with his possession. They remained entwined as the evening air grew colder around them. He held her as if she were the one unwavering constant in a cosmos defined by conspiracy and betrayal. For the first time, she ceased to resist this feeling, recasting her need for him not as a vulnerability, but as the complementary half of her own spirit. Chapter 8. The Morning Shadow. The following day, she awoke in his chamber alone. He had vanished. Outside the window, the estate rested in a state of profound and misleading peace. The conflict had been resolved, the decision made. A tenuous understanding had supplanted the silence, but her gaze detected a flaw in the composition. Tassilo, engaged in a deep discussion with an operative of their adversary, Ennio. The casualness of their exchange sent a wave of cold through her. Such a relaxed meeting with a rival was an act of fundamental treachery. She remained perfectly still, a sculpture by the window, until Tassilo looked up and his gaze immediately flickered away, the quintessential sign of a guilty conscience. Ennio's subordinate departed through a secondary gate. Tassilo began walking toward the main house, his eyes fixed on the path before him. Though she was motionless, her heart began to pound with a specific, primal dread instilled by her upbringing. The peace she had felt was authentic. The connection was undeniable. The memory of Ruggiero's embrace, of his voice resonating against her skin like a confession, all of it had been true. She assimilated this new variable with a frigid certainty. Yet the girl whose father perished in betrayal and debt remained the core of her identity. Life had conditioned her to see trust as a liability and to view peace as merely the quiet interlude before the next disaster. Staring at the empty garden where Tassilo had stood, she understood the true price of loving Ruggiero Cavouri. It was not the overt danger he courted, but the curse of being unable to witness a beautiful morning without instinctively searching for the darkness it concealed. This is Lena. That brings us to the conclusion of our first volume of analysis. The second volume is already prepared. It is available to you for a minor archival fee. Their peace endured for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of resting beside Sicily's most formidable man, before the wall of secrecy was re-erected. He began to lock doors again, to give her that look, the one that signals her imminent return to a state of ignorance. In the 4th week, she awoke to a cold bed and a sentry at her door. Ruggiero had departed during the night for an operation she was not authorized to know about. Then, a faded photograph materialized on her phone. It was her father's face, smiling beside an individual who should never have been there. Below it, a single sentence: "Inquire with your husband about the events of that night." The war had not concluded. It had merely shifted its theater of operations, and the secret was his. As you can see, that was a brief excerpt from Volume 2. To access the complete, uncensored analysis, simply follow the Premier link in the pinned file. I will meet you on the other side. As a reminder, click that first link in the comments And the entire second volume, free of ads and without interruption, will be there for you. It is that straightforward. The work in Volume 2 is profoundly compelling, and for these who agree, I assure you there is more. There, you will discover studies into even more extreme pathologies of true dark romance. And because this version becomes significantly more graphic, the material would never be permitted on a public platform like YouTube.